Hi, I'm Judry Subar. This is Uri L'Tzedek's Talking Torah and Tzedek. I'm here with Rabbi Nissan Antine, who's the senior rabbi of Beth Sholom congregation in Talmud Torah, Potomac, Maryland. That happens to be the shul that I go to. So listeners, it'll be obvious to you then that Rabbi Antine is my rabbi. Very much looking forward to talking to you today about Torah and Tzedek. To start out, I'd like to ask you about how you got into the rabbinate. Some people who are rabbis, particularly pulpit rabbis, are drawn to that line of work because they like to learn and teach, sometimes because of how they think that their learning will help the world to deal with some of its problems and challenges, and some for both of those reasons and others. In your case, what was it that drew you to the rabbinate?
Well, thank you for the question, and also thank you for inviting me. It's really great to be here with you, Judd, and to be with Uri L'Tzedek. So going back to why I actually got interested in being a rabbi, I guess, to some extent, every year of my life, I always wanted to be the rabbi of that year. Like when I was in third grade, I remember very distinctly wanting to be a third grade Rebbe, and fourth grade, and then a high school Rebbe, and et cetera, et cetera. But I guess most immediately when I was in undergrad and actually going through a whole process of thinking about Judaism and what it meant to me after growing up in the yeshiva system, but then really expanding my horizons and really finding myself in the modern Orthodox community, I actually remember two very specific things that probably drew me to the rabbinate. One of them was I just recently gotten married, and my wife Sarah and I, we davened in a shul that was a little bit more to the right from where we were, just in terms of because of where we lived. And I remember that the mechitza in this shul actually had words on it. I forgot what the words were, different psukim. But the psukim were literally etched into the mechitza facing the men's section. And I remember leaving shul one day and asking my wife, Sarah, how was davening today? And she described to me what it was like to be on the women's side. And literally you're looking inside, like the words aren't even in your direction. And it really, really hit me, the disparity, if you will, between men and women. I understand all of the ideas of different roles, but that really just hit me in a deep way. And that really got me to look in more to the whole issue of women's exclusion from certain spaces within Orthodoxy, which were 100% permitted halakhically. So that was really one big motivator to make Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, more accessible for women. And the second thing was when I was in college, that's when the movie Trembling Before God came out. And I remember going and watching the movie and staying up for nights afterwards, just thinking about the implications of that movie. That's, of course, the movie about LGBT inclusion within Orthodoxy, or lack of inclusion. And back then, this was, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s. It was just, it was even much more exclusive and challenging for people who were LGBT. So, and actually, I remember meeting Rabbi Greenberg, who was prominently displayed in the movie. I saw him afterwards, and I drove him home I drove him to his hotel room or whatever it was, or to the airport, I forgot which one, and had a very, very meaningful conversation with him about it. So really, when I became a rabbi, it was really thinking about those populations that had previously been excluded from Orthodoxy, and trying to think about creating an Orthodoxy that was more open and more inclusive. That's certainly what drew me in. I'll have to say, now I've been a rabbi for 15 years. Once you're actually a rabbi and you're dealing with people and situations and pastoral opportunities and life cycle events and shivas and weddings, really my vision of being a rabbi obviously expanded not just to making it more accessible to people who are excluded, but so many people who are in Orthodoxy, who are struggling, who need support, who need learning, who need teaching. So it's really become about a lot more than that. But that was definitely the thing that originally motivated me to become a rabbi.
Okay, so you've been talking about how you perceive the role of a rabbi relative to inclusion within Orthodoxy, maybe inclusion within Judaism. I'd like to expand the horizon of what we're talking about just a bit, or maybe more than a little bit, and ask you about dialoguing and interacting with members of other religions beyond Judaism. I know that some people who are involved in interreligious dialogue want to engage in that sort of activity in order to understand themselves better, sometimes because they want to be understood better by others, sometimes because they have a sense that by talking together with members of other religions, they can figure out how to act together in support of common interests. How do you think interreligious dialogue can help us reach a better world, or maybe it can't? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting. I've definitely participated in many interreligious things with different members of different faith communities. When I went on a conference with a bunch of Catholic priests to Israel, actually, it was fascinating. I participated in Jewish-Muslim dialogue groups. I guess there certainly are certain insights that you could have by learning about other religions, and that certainly helps you understand the other religions, and also, of course, understand your own religion better and some of the focal points of your own religion, and that's certainly helped. But I can't say that's my main motivation when I do engage in those kinds of engagements and exercises. I think it's to me, it's really more just about breaking down barriers and mistrust and sort of the idea of so much of what I see as the divisions in the world and even fighting and even war and even violence and all of those things. A lot of it, I think, comes because we don't know the other and we dehumanize the other, and that leads to demonization and all of those things. So I believe very much in dialogue in all contexts, in the religious sphere, in the political sphere, with people you don't agree with. I think it's very healthy to engage in all of those things. It was not at all a part of my childhood. It would have been very much frowned upon and considered a waste of time at best, and at worst, engaging in pure or heretical activities by talking with people of other faiths. But to me, when you combine ignorance of the other together with power and weapons, as we have, let's say, in Israel and other situations, that's what really leads to dangerous situations in the world. And so, obviously, historically, the Jewish people have not had that much power in that way, so it's not as much of a concern. But it's still something which I feel we should really break down. And I think it leads to less anti-Semitism, less hatred or bigotry or feelings of demonization from the Jewish community to others. So I think it's very, very valuable. But for me, it's less about learning about other people. I mean, I'm curious and I love to read, and you can learn about it that way. But the actual interfaith dialogue, as I think is true about dialogue with all other groups of people, is really more about breaking down barriers, understand people, see the common humanity, see where others are coming from. I think that leads to more unity and harmony in the world.
So picking up on that theme that you've been talking about interacting with the other, breaking down barriers, overcoming bigotry, trying to fight against it. One of the things that I know that you've done a fair bit of reading and thinking and writing and speaking about has to do with African American identity and how Torah teachings can help come to grips with the impact of a slavery that is the slavery in the United States that enslaved so many African American people, but a slavery that theoretically ended over a century ago. I know you've dealt with that on an intellectual level. How about experientially and practically? What are some of the lessons that we can find in the Torah about how to help our country shake off the vestiges of that slavery?
Well, that's a really complicated question, because in general, I'm very hesitant to try to draw big lessons from the Torah to contemporary situations, like a direct lesson, like, oh, if you look at the Torah, here you read this pasuk or this idea, even if you look in the Gemara, that spells out this particular policy consideration or policy advocacy in modern times. I'll give you an example. For instance, as you mentioned, I've given a series of classes on racism, on the legacy of slavery. So I spent a few classes analyzing the issue of reparations, just as an example. And of course, the idea of reparations is very much in the Torah. There's a mitzvah called ha'anaka, which means that when a slave goes free, when a slave is emancipated according to Jewish law, the slave has to be given gifts. And it says ha'anek ta'nikoto. It's double language, which even gives them gifts and more gifts. It's derived actually linguistically from what happened to the Jewish people when we left Mitzrayim. Not only did we get gifts, God gave the favor of the Jewish people in the eyes of the Mitzrayim, and they gave us all these gifts during the plague of darkness. We saw all the things that they had, and then God gave it to us. So we went out with a lot of things, but then it was doubled. Why? Because when we crossed the sea and the Egyptians drowned, we got all their things came on the bank of the Red Sea, and we were able to take that. And that's what really that was our 40 acres and a mule, if you will, that took us into the land of Israel. And that's how we were able to start a country, right? So when you read the Torah, there's clearly a sense of Hanukkah, right? But a literalist, someone who's reading it from a very narrow halachic perspective, would point out that when you learn in the Gemara, you see that Eved who gets Hanukkah, who gets the mitzvah of Hanukkah, is specifically an Eved Ivri, a Jewish slave, not an Eved Kanani. And there might be many specific reasons, and you can go through the sugya, you can go through the Gemara, the discussion in the Gemara, and there are many reasons to say that it doesn't directly apply. And I'm very hesitant to try to take lessons from the Torah and apply them. I just gave one example. You can give many, many examples. And the reason why I'm very hesitant is because I know that there are very, very wise and smart people who will go to the Torah and they'll find proofs that every Jew should own a gun, and another proof that every Jew should not own a gun, or proofs to minimum wage, or proofs that there shouldn't be any kinds of economic regulation, and looking at laws of Shemitah and Yovel, and we can all play those games. So I really believe that, and maybe this is not a popular view as a rabbi, but I really believe that people come to their political views on their own. It's not really because of the Torah. They become because they're immersed in American society. There might be some values behind Torah values that are vaguely informing them, but I really wish everybody would just be honest that their views come from their own views of how they see things. I think this is true on the left, and I think it's true on the right. And then afterwards, we go back into the Torah and justify it. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing to go back to the Torah, because I think that whatever we think and whatever we are passionate about, we should do it through our lens as Jewish people. So in the classes, I would encourage people, no matter how you come out on this, it should be filtered through a deep and immersive study of Torah texts, because that's what we do as Jews. But just like the rabbis of the Gemara, they would study the Chumash and they would come to different views. So we're probably going to do the same thing. So I think it's a mistake to try to say, oh, you see from the Torah that the Torah is in favor of minimum wage or gun control. You know, I think that that's a very prominent thing that happens in, let's say, rabbis in the Reform movement and more liberal movements. There's much more of a I remember I went on a rabbinic trip with a bunch of rabbis to Israel. I happened to have been the only Orthodox rabbi there. And every time, even things that had nothing to do with Israel, every time we kept talking about a political topic, gun control, whatever would come up, you know, one of the rabbis would say, yeah, I'm going to do a drash on that. I'm going to do a drasha on that. And I would be like, why? Why does it necessarily have to be that your views on this come from this and this Torah text? Now, I agree. Let's learn about it. Let's study it. Let's filter it through the Jewish sources. But I think that it's a mistake to take the jump and say that it comes from the Torah. In almost all cases, there might be an exception. But that's what I think. So I believe very strongly that we should be studying Torah in order to learn these texts. But I'm a little bit hesitant and skeptical of the idea of looking at the Torah and having a direct correlation from the Torah text or a Talmud text or a halacha text in terms of how we should act in contemporary times.
Okay, so you do draw a distinction, though. I think actually this is what you're saying, between saying on X issue, whether it's, as you said, gun control or the role of the police in 21st century American society, or whatever it is, you draw a distinction between looking at an issue and saying the Torah tells us that we should take such and such position on the one hand, and on the other hand, saying I have such and such a position, I believe in Torah values, and based on Torah values, my political views, which come from someplace else, are strengthened.
Mm-hmm.
You see a distinction between those two.
Absolutely, yeah. And I do think that there's a role for Jewish values. Like I'll give an example. Like let's say when it comes to issues of minimum wage or issues of, let's say, healthcare, should there be a national healthcare system or not? I think it would be total hubris and just like a total leap to go from the Torah or even halachic sources and try to say this is how it translates into the modern economic system that we have in America, which was not at all what was being described. I think that that's incorrect, and therefore come to the conclusion that either yes, we should have national health care or not, or something like that. But to say that people who are poor are lazy and therefore they don't deserve our help, right? That would be an anti-Torah belief, right? So if, let's say, for instance, people who are on the conservative side, if their argument against national health care or against the minimum wage is because people who are poor deserve to be poor because they don't work hard enough, that's clearly not what the Torah says. The Torah clearly talks about the mitzvah of tzedakah, and when the ani will cry out, Hashem says, "I'll listen to the ani's tears," and we have all these ideas of that you got to help out the ani and you got to help out in a way that's dignified, and the Rambam's prioritization of tzedakah to maintain the dignity of someone who is poor, and there's no sense of shaming someone who's poor and saying that they're lazy. So I think that that's an anti-Torah idea. But if you have somebody who is conservative who says, yes, but I don't believe that a national health care would actually work, and the best way to do it is through privatized medicine, I think it's hard to argue from the Torah which way. Similarly, I'll just to be balanced, I'll use an argument on the left. If someone on the left says, the Torah doesn't care about safety and security, right? It's clearly not true. There are all these mitzvahs of war and self-defense and all that. It's just a question of how to apply these things. So there's definitely certain broader values that can be talked about, that can be articulated. And so therefore, I do think that some positions can be out. Because if a position is articulated with an anti-Torah value, then I think that position can be called out. But the particular policy can almost never be called out. And the reason why that particular policy, from my perspective, cannot be called out is because as long as the person who is articulating that policy is doing it in line with Torah values, then I think that it can be justified.
And what do you think about the following question then? If someone says, I'm wondering whether I should completely separate my thinking about Torah values, which I care about and which I want to uphold, and my political views, so that's one approach. Or maybe I should take a different approach and have my political views, but be inspired to pursue them, whatever they are, by my connection with Torah. Which approach would you say is better, or would you say take your pick?
I definitely think the latter approach is better. I don't think someone should totally sever it. They shouldn't divide it. Because to me, it's inconceivable. This is what David Hartman used to talk about, the idea of Judaism being reduced to pots and pans Judaism. It's inconceivable that our faith and our Torah, which was born out of slavery and then this amazing exodus and going to the land of Israel and trying to figure out how to appropriately use power, and minorities and majorities, all these huge issues that were talked about in the Torah and Chazal and the 3,000-year wisdom tradition of the Jewish people. It's impossible in my mind that it only talks about pots and pans and other, very, very detailed laws, and that it's not addressing the biggest issues of the day. So I do think that however you derive your, political views, and we know, there are even studies why liberals, tend to favor certain kinds of policies and conservatives tend to favor others. And I think that actually most of those things that have to do with trust in government and whatever kinds of things, government solutions, they probably don't have to do with bigger values. So once you come to your policy, I think it's a good thing to sort of be motivated in your activism and in your passion for the topic by Torah and by Torah values. But I think it has to be done with a sense of tzimtzum and modesty, without saying, here we get from this pasuk in the Torah to this particular policy.
So in your view, just to wrap up, as long as someone recognizes that there are limits to the to our ability to look at the Torah and say this is telling us that we should take X position on Y issue. As long as that test is met, if I take a position on a question of racism, inequality, poverty, healthcare access, gun control, whatever it might be, and say, I'm inspired to work in support of my position. I'm inspired to push policymakers and decision makers to take particular positions because of the Torah values that I believe in. Ultimately, with the caveat that I mentioned at the beginning, in your view, that's a good thing.
Absolutely right. That should definitely happen. But another caveat that I would say is we shouldn't feel that should definitely be done by individual Jews and even by groups of Jews and Jewish institutions and organizations that are dedicated to those causes. That's wonderful. But we shouldn't make the mistake to believe that every Jewish institution and organization and shul and Bikur Cholim and Chevra Kadisha all have to be engaged in this process, as important people think that the particular political views and outcomes are. It's okay to have institutions and organizations. I think that this is particularly true about Orthodox shuls, right? Modern Orthodox shuls right now. If you look across the spectrum, you'll see that, if you look more in the Haredi community, it seems to be much more in the conservative way, politically conservative. Again, I grew up in the Haredi community. It was not like that clear when I was growing up in that way, but now it really is. If you look more in the liberal community, it seems to be more aligned with the values and the policies of the Democratic Party and liberals. But in modern Orthodoxy, it's like the one place in America where there's true political diversity, and I think that's okay. One of my challenges as a rabbi is, while I strongly support my congregants on both sides of the aisle pushing their issues, pushing their agendas, and doing it with Torah values, it doesn't mean that the shul has to be the locus and the place where that kind of an advocacy takes place. The shul can transcend that. First of all, the shul can go back to the underlying values, like I said, compassion for the poor, but not necessarily particular ways that happens. And also the shul has many other functions besides, political advocacy. In 2016, 2020, with politics being so intense right now, I think sometimes it's hard for people to see that any important institution in their life is not weighing in on those issues. And I strongly disagree with that. There's so much more to life than what happened with the election, this past election or whatever. There's just so much more to life. The example I always give is I never ever saw someone show up to a Shiva minyan and they said, okay, it's great that you came, but who did you vote for in the last election? It just doesn't happen. I never saw that there was a bar mitzvah in shul or bat mitzvah and they threw the candies and then we're dancing around and someone said, yeah, but which party did you vote for? Or that's true about the chesed and all the other things that we do. I think that shuls really have unique ability, one of the only public areas in our community where we can transcend that. And I think people should there's something sacred about that. And we shouldn't try to change that, even if individuals in the shul should be very active. And hopefully they're learning texts in shul that are teaching values that might even inspire them in the other organizations that they're part of. But I think that there needs to be organizations that are not part of that.
You're talking obviously as a shul rabbi explicitly, and I'm here in my capacity as someone who's involved with Uri L'Tzedek, which is a non-shul organization. So it's interesting to hear you draw that distinction. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for your thoughts. This has been great.
Thank you. It's been wonderful being with you.